The ocean was never empty. Before Europeans arrived in the Pacific, the ocean was already mapped, just not on paper. Tupaia was born into a world where islands were not isolated points, but nodes in a living network remembered through genealogy. Stars, winds, currents, and ritual knowledge passed orally across generations. To Europeans, the Pacific appeared vast, broken, and mostly empty, with islands scattered randomly across an unknowable expanse. To Tupaia, it was continuous. He learned navigation not as technique, but as responsibility, memorizing star paths, seasonal wind shifts, wave refraction patterns, bird flight behaviors, and the timing of swells that rebounded off unseen land hundreds of miles away. Direction was not determined by instruments, but by relationship, how the canoe moved relative to the sky, the water, and memory carried in chant. Islands Europeans believed unconnected were already bound together by roots that existed only as knowledge, not infrastructure. Tupaia could describe these routes without drawing them, reciting distances in nights of travel, correcting for drift, current, and weather that no European chart accounted for. When Captain James Cook entered the Pacific, believing he was discovering isolated worlds, he encountered Tupaia, who immediately understood that Europeans were navigating blind. Cook had instruments. Tupaia had context. Cook's charts measured position, but they did not explain how islands related to one another, or why certain routes were possible only at certain times of year. Tupaia joined the voyage not as a curiosity, but as an interpreter of an ocean Europeans did not yet understand. He translated not just language, but geography, explaining which islands shared ancestry, trade, conflict, and migration histories that stretched back centuries. Through Tupaia, Europeans learned that the Pacific was not a void separating land, but a medium connecting it. He guided Cook through island chains Europeans assumed could not be intentionally traversed, correcting course decisions based on swell direction and wind logic rather than compass alone. European sailors watched as Tupaia identified islands still beyond the horizon, not by sight, but by reading subtle changes in wave rhythm and bird movement that signaled land ahead. This knowledge unsettled European assumptions, because it revealed that vast distances could be crossed deliberately without ships built for endurance or maps built for authority. Tupaia demonstrated that Polynesian navigation was not accidental island hopping, but a system precise enough to sustain settlement across half the planet. Cook's expedition recorded routes that would later be credited as European discoveries, even though the pathways themselves had been known long before European arrival. Tupaia's role became quietly minimized as voyages were written up for audiences that preferred singular heroes over shared knowledge. Yet without him, Cook's understanding of the Pacific would have remained fragmented, slow, and dangerously incomplete. The irony was sharp. Europe believed it was teaching the world how to navigate oceans, while depending entirely on a man whose culture had already mastered one. Tupaia did not conquer the sea. He remembered it, and by sailing with Europeans, he revealed that what they called discovery was often re-encounter. Tupaia carried no charts, because charts were unnecessary in a system where geography was remembered as sequence rather than surface. Navigation began before departure, through chant and recitation that fixed roots in memory by embedding them in story, genealogy, and obligation. Distances were not measured in miles, but in nights of travel, prevailing winds, and the behavior of seas under different skies. Tupaia understood that the ocean changed character depending on what lay beneath it, because swells bent and reflected off land long before shore became visible. He read wave interference patterns, the way Europeans read coastlines, distinguishing deep ocean swell from reflected wave systems that indicated islands beyond sight. Stars did not serve as static points, but as moving guides whose rising and setting angles created directional corridors that shifted seasonally. Tupaia memorized star paths, not as abstractions, but as lived experience, knowing which stars governed which routes and when those routes were safe to travel. Wind was treated not as resistance, but as information, signaling where weather systems would allow or forbid passage days in advance. Words were not omens, but data, because their flight direction at dawn and dusk revealed the presence of land within predictable ranges. Cloud formations, hovering stationary on the horizon, signaled islands reflecting moisture upward, creating visible markers in otherwise uniform sky. All of this knowledge operated simultaneously, requiring constant attention rather than intermittent calculation. European navigation isolated variables into instruments, assuming that position alone guaranteed safety. Tupaia's system assumed that safety depended on relationships among many moving elements. When Cook's expedition moved between island groups, Tupaia explained how those islands were already connected culturally and historically through migration and exchange. He identified which chiefs shared lineage, which islands traded regularly, and which harbored long-standing rivalries that could turn landfall into danger. This information proved as valuable as navigation itself, allowing Cook's crew to avoid conflicts they did not understand and could not predict alone. Tupaia's guidance turned what Europeans experienced as a sequence of isolated encounters into a coherent regional map. Cook's charts began to reflect continuity rather than scatter, though the credit would later be assigned unevenly. European observers struggled to categorize Tupaia's expertise because it did not resemble formal science or written scholarship. Yet his accuracy surpassed theirs whenever instruments failed under cloud cover, storm, or cumulative drift. Tupaia corrected course decisions quietly, often before Europeans recognized error had occurred. His authority remained informal, because European hierarchy placed indigenous knowledge below command even when it proved indispensable. The voyages advanced not because European methods replaced Polynesian ones, but because Polynesian knowledge filled the gaps European methods could not address. Tupaia embodied a navigation system refined over centuries without leaving physical traces that empire could claim, and in doing so he revealed that the Pacific had never been empty, lost, or waiting to be discovered. It had been known all along, just not written down. When Tupaia sailed with James Cook, the expedition gained more than a translator or local guide. It gained access to an ocean that was already understood as a system rather than an obstacle. Cook's instruments could calculate latitude and estimate longitude, but they could not explain where routes existed, when they were safe, or why islands appeared in clusters that made sense only to those who knew their relationships. Tupaia provided that missing logic, describing the Pacific not as scattered landfalls but as connected pathways shaped by migration, trade, and memory. As the ship moved between islands, Tupaia identified destinations that were not yet visible, explaining which lay ahead, which lay beyond, and which should be avoided entirely based on seasonal conditions. European sailors initially treated these predictions as coincidence, until repeated accuracy made dismissal impossible. Tupaia drew maps for Cook that did not resemble European charts, arranging islands according to voyaging sequences rather than scale, showing how one place led to another across open water. These maps unsettled European assumptions because they implied intentional long-distance navigation across spaces Europeans believed too vast to cross without error. Cook relied on Tupaia's counsel when deciding routes between island groups, adjusting course based on swell direction, wind behavior, and bird activity that instruments could not interpret. When storms disrupted celestial navigation, Tupaia's reading of the sea maintained orientation where European methods faltered. He advised where landfall would be welcomed and where it would provoke hostility, translating cultural geography that no chart recorded. Encounters that might have turned violent were navigated diplomatically because Tupaia recognized shared ancestry and protocol long before. Europeans understood they were trespassing into known networks. European records later described these successful passages as feats of leadership and seamanship, while Tupaia's role was reduced to background assistance. Yet, without him, Cook's progress through the Central Pacific would have been slower, riskier, and far more prone to catastrophic misunderstanding. Tupaia's knowledge compressed uncertainty, transforming an ocean Europeans feared into one they could traverse with growing confidence. This confidence would later be misremembered as European mastery, even though it rested on indigenous systems that were never fully acknowledged. Tupaia navigated without claiming discovery, because discovery implied absence, and absence did not exist in his worldview. The islands had names, histories, and routes long before Cook arrived. What Cook encountered was not wilderness, but memory made visible through movement. As the voyage continued, Tupaia's health deteriorated under unfamiliar conditions, and his influence diminished as European narratives took precedence. By the time the expedition returned northward, much of the Pacific knowledge he had shared was already being filtered through European frameworks that stripped context and authorship. The ocean that Cook would later describe to audiences had been reshaped into a European story, even though its pathways had been revealed by someone who never needed a compass to know where he was. Tupaia's contribution endured quietly, embedded in routes, charts, and assumptions that would guide future voyagers without naming their source. He had guided Europeans across an ocean they believed empty, and shown them that it had always been full of meaning, structure, and connection. And once that knowledge was absorbed into empire, the man who carried it became easier to forget than to credit. As Cook's voyage entered European record, the structure of the story began to change, not in facts, but in emphasis. Charts were finalized, journals edited, and discoveries framed in language that privileged instruments, command, and national achievement. The knowledge that made those achievements possible was absorbed without attribution, treated as context rather than contribution. Tupaia's guidance became background assistance in accounts that elevated European navigation as the primary force at work. This was not accidental. European systems were built to credit what could be written, measured, and claimed, while oral knowledge that lived in people rather than documents resisted ownership. Tupaia did not fit the role of discoverer because discovery required absence, and he insisted on continuity instead. When islands appeared on European maps, they were labeled as new even when Tupaia had already described their relationships, names, and histories. The ocean was redrawn as a series of points rather than pathways, because pathways implied prior movement that could not be claimed. As the voyage progressed, Tupaia's health weakened under exposure, unfamiliar diet, and disease brought aboard European ships. His ability to influence decisions declined as authority consolidated around written orders rather than lived observation. By the time Cook's findings circulated widely, Tupaia's role had already been reduced to a footnote, when it was mentioned at all. Yet the routes Cook followed continued to reflect Polynesian navigation logic rather than European conjecture. Islands appeared in sequence, not scatter. Landfalls aligned with swell patterns and seasonal winds rather than straight lines. These choices endured because they worked, even when the reason they worked was forgotten. European audiences celebrated mastery of the Pacific without recognizing that mastery had been borrowed. Navigation manuals adopted assumptions first demonstrated by Polynesian voyaging while denying the sophistication of the cultures that developed them. This contradiction persisted comfortably because it supported empire without challenging hierarchy. Tupaia's disappearance from record mirrored a broader erasure of indigenous systems once they were converted into European advantage. Knowledge could be used without being named. Routes could be followed without honoring those who remembered them. Tupaia did not seek recognition, because his role was never to claim the ocean, only to move through it responsibly. But history, structured around conquest and credit, required singular authorship. What could not be owned was minimized. What could not be measured was doubted. And what could not be written was eventually forgotten. The Pacific remained connected, but the story of who had always known it that way was quietly removed from the center of the narrative. When Europeans described the Pacific as empty, they erased not only people, but systems that had regulated movement across it for centuries. Navigation without context turned routes into lines rather than responsibilities, encouraging travel without regard for season, reciprocity, or consequence. Polynesian voyaging had never been about speed or conquest, but about balance, ensuring that movement did not exhaust people, land, or sea. By treating the ocean as vacant space, Europeans removed the social limits that had governed when and how travel should occur. This shift accelerated exploitation, because an empty ocean could be crossed repeatedly without obligation to those who already lived within it. The replacement of memory with charts allowed expansion to scale, but it also stripped navigation of restraint. Routes once traveled only under specific conditions became standardized, ignoring the environmental signals that Polynesian navigators had respected instinctively. As European ships multiplied, accidents increased in waters that had been crossed safely for generations, because instruments could not read swell language or seasonal nuance. Knowledge that once lived communally was reduced to fragments useful for empire, leaving behind the ethics that sustained it. Tupaia's navigation was inseparable from accountability, because knowing a route meant accepting responsibility for those who followed it. European systems separated navigation from consequence, allowing decision-makers to remain distant from risk. This distance altered how the Pacific was treated, transforming a lived environment into a transit zone. Island societies felt the impact quickly, as routes that had once been reciprocal became extractive. The ocean did not change. The logic governing it did. Tupaia's guidance had offered Europeans an alternative model, one that recognized the sea as inhabited, relational, and conditional. That model was quietly discarded once its immediate utility had been extracted. What was lost was not technique, but worldview. Navigation became an act of control rather than understanding. The Pacific became something to cross, not something to listen to. Tupaia's knowledge survived only where it continued to be practiced outside European systems, preserved through teaching rather than documentation. The cost of treating the ocean as empty was paid unevenly, felt most sharply by those whose expertise had been essential but uncredited. The sea remained full. Only the story told about it was hollowed out. Tupaia did not leave behind monuments, because Polynesian navigation was never designed to be fixed in stone or paper. Its durability depended on people remembering, teaching, and practicing knowledge continuously rather than preserving it as artifact. When European records minimized Tupaia's role, they did not erase his impact on navigation, only his visibility within written history. The routes he revealed continued to guide movement across the Pacific long after his name faded from official accounts. Cook's charts, celebrated for their accuracy, followed pathways already validated by generations of voyagers who never needed ink to confirm them. European exploration built confidence by standing on indigenous certainty while denying its source. This denial shaped historical memory, reinforcing the idea that navigation required instruments rather than understanding. Yet modern rediscovery of Polynesian voyaging has confirmed what Tupaia demonstrated firsthand. Experimental voyagers using traditional methods have successfully crossed the Pacific, reproducing routes Europeans once believed accidental. These voyagers revealed that the Pacific had always been intentionally navigated, settled, and maintained as a connected world. Tupaia's knowledge was not exceptional within his culture. It was representative. What made him unique was not mastery alone, but circumstance. His presence at the moment Europeans needed guidance most and were least prepared to acknowledge it. His legacy challenges how discovery is defined, shifting emphasis from first arrival to sustained understanding. He reminds history that knowledge can exist without documentation and that absence of paper does not equal absence of system. The Pacific did not become connected through European exploration. It was already connected. Europeans simply learned how late they were. Tupaia's contribution remains essential because it exposes a blind spot that still shapes how knowledge is valued. Skills that cannot be easily claimed or archived are often treated as supplemental rather than foundational. Tupaia was foundational. He made possible a new phase of movement while representing an older, more responsible one. His story survives now not as correction, but as reminder that oceans are not empty, that navigation is relational, and that history often credits those who write rather than those who remember. After Tupaia's death, European voyagers continued across the Pacific with growing confidence, unaware that much of that confidence rested on knowledge already given and then unnamed. Routes that once required careful interpretation were treated as solved problems, because charts preserved outcomes without preserving reasoning. This separation mattered, because when conditions changed, charts could not explain why earlier success no longer applied. European navigators crossed safely when circumstances aligned, and failed catastrophically when they did not, rediscovering too late the limits of abstraction. Meanwhile, Polynesian navigation persisted outside imperial record, continuing to function because it adapted continuously rather than freezing knowledge in fixed form. The ocean responded better to systems that listened than to systems that assumed control. Tupaia's way of knowing survived in practice, not preservation, carried forward through teaching that required presence, humility, and repetition. His absence from official narratives did not diminish the accuracy of the system he represented. It only obscured responsibility for acknowledging it. Modern science would later confirm the principles Tupaia embodied, recognizing swell refraction, wave interference, and environmental cues as reliable indicators of land and direction. What had once been dismissed as intuition was reframed as data once it could be named and measured. Yet naming arrived long after mastery had already existed. Tupaia's story reveals a pattern repeated across history, where indigenous knowledge is accepted only after it is detached from its source and reclassified within dominant frameworks. The Pacific did not need to be discovered to be known. It needed to be respected to be navigated well. Tupaia demonstrated that respect through movement that never separated destination from responsibility. His guidance showed that survival across vast spaces depended less on conquest than on alignment with systems already in motion. When Europeans finally recognized the Pacific as a connected world, they did so using pathways revealed by someone they chose not to fully credit. The ocean continued to remember those pathways regardless of how history recorded them. It rewarded attention and punished assumption exactly as it always had. And in that continuity, Tupaia's knowledge endured beyond any single voyage. Tupaia did not teach Europeans how to conquer the Pacific. He showed them that it had never been empty, random, or unknowable. He carried an ocean in memory, navigated by relationship rather than domination, and revealed connections that charts alone could not explain. When that knowledge was absorbed into empire, his name faded while the roots remained. This was not because his contribution was small, but because it worked too well to be questioned. The Pacific still rewards those who listen more than those who assume. Tupaia's legacy lives wherever navigation respects conditions rather than imposes certainty. Follow to keep the lantern lit. Some maps are written in stars, swells, and memory, and they never needed ink to endure.